Paul first preached in the large Roman province of Galatia, located in what is now central Turkey, on his first missionary journey. A short time later, he was disturbed by reports that troublemakers had visited Galatia. They were insisting that it was necessary for Gentile converts to be circumcised. Paul wrote this letter to clarify the matter in no uncertain terms. In the process, he also revealed much about how he understood his apostleship. Galatians is one of Paul's earliest letters, probably written while he was in Ephesus, and it is full of important teaching. For this video segment, I'll be both host and presenter. I will focus on a frequently overlooked emphasis in this and other letters, Paul's use of maternal imagery. The writer George Bernard Shaw once called the Apostle Paul the eternal enemy of women. Vast numbers of people, many of whom may never have read Paul's letters, share that opinion. They may know only that he said women should be silent in church and should keep their heads covered. We don't have to search hard to find passages that seem to support Shaw's claim. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul argues that women should keep their heads covered and men their hair short. He bases that argument on the claim that the husband is the head of his wife. Later in the same letter, he, or perhaps a follower of his, insists that women should keep silent in the church. Other passages conflict sharply with these perspectives. In Romans 16, Paul recommends Phoebe, whom he calls a deacon of the church. Later in that same chapter, he greets a woman named Junia, who is said to be prominent among the apostles. These references seem to make clear there were women in leadership roles in the churches Paul founded. Galatians 3:28 forcefully underscores our impression that Paul saw the gospel as a radical challenge to all social distinctions. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female. So the evidence is confusing. It has prompted almost endless discussion, and often people seem to line up to do battle, using these and other passages to support their particular point of view. Instead of declaring war, we might look at another and very striking set of texts, those in which Paul speaks of himself as if he were the mother of his churches. Perhaps the most fascinating of these texts is Galatians 4:19. My little children, for whom I am again in the pain of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you. Notice how complex this statement is. Paul is the mother of believers. He is in the process of giving birth to them again. The threat to their faith is so powerful that he can think of this as a second labor. Paul remains in labor not until the child is born, but until Christ is born in the child. I think we catch a glimpse here of just how much anguish Paul experienced over his churches. He uses similar language in other letters. In 1 Thessalonians 2:7, as he is speaking about his initial visit to Thessalonica, Paul recalls that he and his associates were like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. What an evocative image. In Roman society, many families employed wet nurses to feed infants. These were often beloved figures, warmly remembered and honored by their charges when they matured. Paul invokes that association, but he multiplies it. He was not just a nurse caring for a child, but a nurse caring for her own children. Another passage in 1 Corinthians 3 has a somewhat scolding tone. Paul is chiding the Corinthians for their immature behavior and says, "I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food." That may not sound like maternal language to us, accustomed as we are to the baby bottle and infant formula. In Paul's world, however, feeding with milk was the task of the mother or the wet nurse and no one else. What does it mean to find Paul using language that belongs to the world of mothers and their children? Three things come to mind, although you may think of others as well. First, Paul's use of maternal language is another way of cultivating a family relationship among Christians. To be, in some sense, a child of the apostle is to be closely connected to him and to others who are also children of the apostle. We are in the same family. Although we may experience difficulties in our families, we remain part of the family in good times and bad. Second, when Paul speaks of himself as a mother, he makes himself vulnerable. A woman who is in labor with a child knows she is vulnerable. She is not in control of how her labor will progress or when the child will actually appear. A nursing mother is also at the disposal of a baby. Despite all attempts at organizing infant feeding schedules, it is the baby who knows when she or he is hungry. Third, in Paul's culture, mothers did not have the authority of fathers. When Paul presents himself as a mother, he voluntarily hands over the authority of a patriarch in favor of a role that will bring him shame, the shame of a female-identified male. It is fascinating that we talk about these passages so seldom. Even scholarly commentaries have little to say about them. That was not true for earlier generations in the church's life, where there was a real appreciation for Paul's language. In the 11th century, Anselm of Canterbury composed a prayer to Paul in which he wrote, "O St. Paul, where is he that was called the nurse of the faithful? Who is that affectionate mother who declares everywhere that she is in labor? Sweet nurse, sweet mother, who are the children you are in labor with and nurse, but those whom by teaching the faith of Christ you bear and instruct?" Was Shaw right? Is Paul an enemy of women? Or is he, as others would have it, an early champion of women? If we insist on asking the question that way, the answer must be neither. Paul is not an enemy to women, set out to subject them to male authority. Neither is Paul intentionally trying to liberate women. Still, a man who images himself as a mother to others is a man who knows that the gospel of Jesus Christ calls us to standards of evaluation that are not determined by what the rest of the world thinks is masculine or feminine. This is a man women can welcome as a partner.